Thanks for coming. I've already kind of had my big line given by, I think it was Shigenaka. History, experience really are the major drivers as far as I'm concerned with where we're going to go in the future. And so we have lots of history and drivers here today. One thing is I tried to recruit panelists for the Exxon Valdez session. I realized that 25 years is quite a long time, longer than I thought. I'm only 43, but some of the people that were involved in Exxon are getting up there. And so we actually had some real issues with boots on the ground people to get to this session. But then I had some breakfast this morning over at the hotel, and about every third person I ran into had been at the Exxon Valdez. And so the one point I wanted to make is I think it's so important to be here today because 25 years have gone by. Some of the history, some of the experience that I think is so important to where we want to go is slowly being lost. In my recruiting, three of the key players, one from NOAA, one from a co-op, and one from Exxon, who all, two at least of the three had agreed to be here, passed away before the meeting. And so I don't want to get maudlin and talk about age being a big problem, but why it's so important to be here today. We have to take advantage of some of the significant players that we have in this room, the experience that we had from Exxon and everything in between to Deepwater. So I'll kick off the session, but before I did that, I thought I would like all of the people that were involved in Exxon Valdez that are in this room just to stand up, just very briefly. Wow. I thought most of you were dead, and here you are. So as you know, Nancy's already made the point that we have bios, extensive bios, for everybody that's going to speak today. They're available online. We have decided not to spend a lot of time on the bios, more on the people and what they have to say. And so our first speaker is Ed Page. U.S. Coast Guard was several things over the course of the Exxon, has had an illustrious career beyond that, but has agreed to kind of represent the operational Coast Guard side of what happened in Exxon Valdez. And for the rest of you on the panel, I'm going to talk or send Ed up, and then we'll have one other speaker, and then we'll bring the panel and bring everybody up if you don't recall that. So Ed, you've got it. Please come up.
I have a bunch of tickets for if you want to fly to Alaska after this presentation, so hopefully Chamber of Commerce will appreciate what I've done here. Actually, my history, as I thought the other day about what I'm going to say, and at one point Nancy Kinner said, make sure we're going to give you a little more time because you need to tell not everybody knows the Exxon Valdez spill. I'm going, how could that be? Because some people born after the Exxon Valdez spill, which makes us feel older. And then so I started reflecting, like, why is it so incredibly obvious to me, not everybody else? And I realized that my tie-in to Valdez and the incident started over 40 years ago, and it's still going on. I'm still involved with it. So some people, it just can't escape. It's a circularity that Gary was talking about, whatever. I can't seem to escape this thing with Valdez. And it actually started when I was in the Coast Guard Academy. In about 1970, after a couple of years there, I was taking a course in transportation. They said, and I did a report on the Valdez facility that was going to be transporting crude oil from Alaska to the lower 48. And that was several years before they even opened up the facility. And then a couple of years later, I was sailing out of Boston on a Coast Guard cutter doing patrols off the North Atlantic. And after a year of doing that, they said, but how would you like to try the Bering Sea? I said, oh, that sounds like fun. Sounds a lot like the North Atlantic. So I was fortunate enough to load my sailboat on the Coast Guard cutter Boutwell, and we went through the Panama Canal and up and started sailing Alaska waters. And then I got hooked. I got fascinated with it, but I did serve in California and in Seattle and other assignments. But in the course of the marine safety program, and I got involved in oil spills and search and rescue, I was enamored and still intrigued with Alaska. And so at one point, I talked to the Coast Guard and let me do an internship with Exxon. And I sailed on Exxon tankers for several months, and even sailed to Alaska and to Valdez on one of the Exxon vessels. So I got appreciation for what that was all about. And I sailed on other vessels, container ships and tugboats and fishing boats over the years in Alaska. And then I got involved in the marine safety program, and I enjoyed oil spill response. I hate to say it. It was pretty exciting back in the 80s when we were out in the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Sea and other places, and your beaches, and ATVs, and it's wild, and ships are burning, and very exciting times. Until the tank vessel Glacier Bay, which was actually sailed from Valdez and went over to Cook Inlet with Alaska North Slope crude oil, ran aground in Cook Inlet. And I got the call from the captain early in the morning and told me he ran aground. I was chief of operations, getting ready to go on vacation with my family. That was canceled. And I saw the dark side of oil spills because the impact on the fisheries. And it was an awful spill as far as several 100,000 gallons, but just the impacts. Suddenly, I didn't like oil spills. It was very painful, very disturbing. It was one thing in the wild out in the open, but when it started impacting people's lives, it changed the whole focus. And a couple of years later, my daughter was just born. My second daughter was born. And then a couple of weeks later, I was in a search and rescue assignment down in southeast Alaska. I saw the Exxon Valdez and I said, oh, thank God I'm not in the oil spill response business anymore. That's going to be ugly. It didn't take long. I got the phone call. And that evening, I was at flight. A couple months later, my daughter said to my wife, my older daughter, that is, was 6 years old at the time, she said, this is good practice in case Dad dies, which I didn't appreciate that because I just disappeared. And so, anyway, I did live through it, but I did spend 3 years in various capacities at Exxon Valdez spill. And then subsequently, I was after the Exxon Valdez spill, working with the Admiral Shangolini. I was dispatched to be the captain of port for Los Angeles Long Beach, and lo and behold, those tankers from Valdez are showing up right in LA Long Beach. And so I said, I don't want an oil spill, and that drove some tug escort procedures I incorporated, and the vessel traffic service I incorporated, several safety measures because of the lessons I learned from the Exxon Valdez spill. And then later I was Chief of Marine Safety Pacific Area, and then I retired about 14 years ago now, and started the Marine Exchange of Alaska, which is a nonprofit organization that's geared towards tracking vessels. And even today now, I can pick up my little iPhone, I can tell you what ships are in Valdez or anywhere else in Alaska and the Arctic. There's a system we built, a vessel tracking system, and then also a couple of years ago I started another nonprofit called the Alaska Maritime Prevention Response Network, and it's also oriented towards preventing and enhanced response to oil spills. So I can't just shake it. It's just still in my blood, and it's all related to the Valdez. So it's really been a big part of my life. So I need to say that I'm really representing and standing in for Admiral Dave Shangolini, who was the Federal On-Scene Coordinator at Spill. Very passionate, poured his heart into it, very excitable man. And of course, he surrounded himself with very smart people, including Dave Kennedy, who was just standing to the right of him. Be right, yep. He was a young man back then. Actually, he was a good racquetball player then, too. He even beat me in racquetball, so go figure. I'm still hurting over that one. But anyway, I worked with him on several different capacities. I was a regional operations guy. I ended up being head of operations, chief of staff, and then later on I was chief of marine during the spill, parts of it. I was chief of environmental protection for Alaska. I was implementing Open 90 follow-on regulations and what have you. So let me talk a little about Alaska. Alaska is just looking out from my deck in my house, actually. It's a beautiful location, but it's raw. It's wilderness. It's like Yosemite, but in enormous, bigger scale, or Acadia National Park, or what have you. And so all the things you hear about the natural, the whales and the king crab right at your front yard and the fishing, these are things that's basically an unspoiled wilderness to some extent. And all these pictures, and of course we have to compete with bears when we're trying to get our fish, but usually we prevail. And of course we have icebergs and glaciers and whatever, and all this kind of intertwines because it's a raw materials state. And even though we have an expansive area, our real product and what we produce is raw materials. And whether it's oil, obviously, coming from the North Slope, it's got shipped out by tankers. Raw materials like zinc and gold and silver are shipped out by cargo vessels. Even the fish that we catch are shipped out on vessels, either container ships or reefer ships, what have you. So maritime, it is a maritime state. There's no more state that's, I believe, is more maritime dependent. I can't leave my house unless I got a plane or a boat. I can't drive out of Juneau. Even though it's a capital, I can't drive out of Juneau. I have to get on a boat or a plane. So maritime, and everything comes in by ship, by barge, what have you. So we're clearly a maritime state. And it's like a I-95. Ships are transiting through Aleutian Islands on the way from Seattle to the Far East with containers and oil and what have you. So it's a very, very busy state. And of course, the background of Exxon Valdez is that we had oil up in North Slope. We had to get it out somehow. They explored the option of tankers going across the Arctic. That wasn't such a good idea. So they built this 800-mile pipeline down to Valdez, which was a ice-free port. Ice-free in that it's not solid ice, but there's still ice in Prince William Sound. So the pipeline runs down to Valdez. The tankers come to Valdez and then ship it down to Lower 48 for processing. And at the height, it was about 2 million barrels a day during the Exxon Valdez that was being pumped out of Alaska down to Lower 48. That's down to about 600,000 barrels a day right now. And so when you look at all this and all activity, maritime activity, that 99.99% success equals public outrage. That's basically what it comes down to. We have a tremendous track record to a very good safety net, to the International Maritime Organization, the Coast Guard, the state of Alaska has much oversight, and when you really look down, statistically, the shipping industry is very, very safe. However, it's a very high-stakes game. When things go wrong, they go wrong big. We all know cruise ships are extremely safe, but when they go bad, it's an international incident. An oil spill is an international incident. So it's a very high stakes and very high standard and very high expectations that are placed upon the Coast Guard and the states and what have you. So what was the issue with the Exxon Valdez? Well, the ice from the Columbia ice field was breaking off, and it would enter the shipping channels. And the concern was you didn't want to hit ice. In fact, one tanker did, in fact, hit ice, and you can see the damage to the hull of that tanker to overseas Ohio. And so that's what the Exxon Valdez was avoiding the night that it ran aground. Exxon Valdez wasn't a super huge ship. It was called a very large crude carrier as opposed to ultra-large crude carriers. There's vessels twice that size, but this vessel's still 3 football fields in length. It could carry 1.5 million barrels of oil. These are big ships, very big ships, and a crew of 21. And the captain, Hazelwood, basically broke the law. He didn't stay on the bridge. He's supposed to be on the bridge. He went out of the channel. He did tell the Coast Guard he was going out of the channel to avoid ice. And he notified the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was not concerned at that time because of budget constraints. They originally planned to have vessel traffic system throughout Prince William Sound, but they limited it only to the Valdez Narrows. So he was beyond the eyes of the Coast Guard. They're no longer paying attention to that. It was beyond the scope of their responsibility. He called them and told them they were out of the channel. Then he went down below, and the crew messed up. Not actually sure what happened, whether they were on an autopilot or what have you, but they didn't return to the course they're supposed to turn, and they hit Bligh Reef. And out of the 50 million gallons that the vessel was carrying, 11 million gallons were spilled. 130,000 square miles of water were impacted. 1,300 miles of shoreline. During the course of 3 years, in the first year, there's 12,000 responders. It took 3 years and $2 billion plus to address that oil spill. And I think that if you run the numbers, probably about 10%, if that, of the oil was recovered. So this was an eye-opener for me. It was the Armageddon. It was a thing we all dreaded. And but one of the good things about it, if I can say anything good, is that it could have been a lot worse, and that the salvage operation was able to keep majority of the oil from entering the environment. So 80% of the oil was actually transferred to other vessels, and I hate to even imagine if it all went in the water, because we still had our hands full with only 20% of the oil being released in the oil. What are the response tools? Well, the key thing I learned there is that one is once you've seen one spill, you've seen one spill. Every spill is different. Depends on nature of the oil, the location, time of year, what have you. But one thing is pretty clear. You need to come up with a full toolbox and many, many tools. And the frustrating thing with that is that not everybody's going to allow you to use your tools. I hate to think of doing a project. My wife said, no, you can't use that skill saw, and you can't use that drill, and you can't. How am I going to build this thing? And we were constantly having challenges, and part of that's preparedness and people understanding what the tools are and what they can do. And so there were challenges as to whether that's the right tool, whether we should be able to use that tool, whatever. But some tools are pretty basic and were readily used, but they weren't available because people were kind of asleep at the switch. The vessels that were supposed to be, the major vessel supposed to be involved in spill response at the time was in the shipyard. It wasn't even in the water. But the traditional tools and non-traditional tools were applied during the Exxon Valdez in the course of the time. Oil skimmers, aerial dispersants, in-situ burning, containment booms, water washing, we call storm burn relocation, where we actually took the oil that was up at the upper end of the beach and dragged it back into the tide line so it could the natural cleansing of the waves and then capture that oil again. Bioremediation, where accelerated the natural biodegradation of materials to nutrients that would do it. So there are many different tools that we use, a lot of conflict over that, a lot of dispute. And so some cases we just flat stopped, didn't use the aerial dispersant. Some cases we stopped in situ burning, good tools that were stopped. And very, very frustrating, those who understood the science of it. But when you're in an emergency, that's not the time to start arguing the science of what's good and what's not so good. And this is an example of the spread of the oil. It went 1,300 miles along the Alaska coast, and they can kind of see it migrating along. It was an incredible challenge to try to get arms around it. And the fact is, and it impacted 1,300 miles of shoreline. Not to this degree, but they were very thick, deep oil. You could stand it inches, several inches thick, and then it got into moose. It got into hatcheries. It impacted fisheries, had to be shut down. Heavy equipment and beaches that never had been any equipment ever been on it. I kayaked before and after the Exxon Valdez, but I kayaked beforehand, and these were just isolated beaches. Suddenly, there was heavy equipment just dropped on these beaches, and people spraying chemicals, and thousands of people around the beaches. So it's just a phenomenal response. And as Gary pointed out, you look at the scale of it around the world. It wasn't a huge spill, but many consider it the most environmentally impacting spill. And I don't know how that compares to the Macondo spill, but up until then, anyway. Because it was a kind of a protected environment, it was a fragile environment, it was very rich wildlife, and the oil was persistent, and you didn't have 12 months a year to clean it up. You had a cold environment, you had to just shut down operation in the wintertime because it was unsafe to do it, and really just totally ineffective in the wintertime. So it's in the world standard, and it impacted the world community as far as shipping activity and risk management. The Open 90 legislation wasn't limited to the United States. Any ship that called the United States, and IMO turned around and said, we got to do more things similar to this. So it was a watershed event, and a lot of lessons to be learned, and we're still learning, and some things we haven't learned. My perception, Ed Page's perception for what it's worth, and there are many other experts around here, but I suddenly realized this is kind of like a forest fire. And that in forest fires, Mother Nature kind of calls the shots. And if it's going to be hot and dry and windy, that fire is going to go wherever it wants to go. And the tools that we're using in a forest fire, we're actually pushing people out of the planes in parachutes. Still doing that. Planes with this a fire retardant flying over the fires. And the people in the parachute, when they hit the ground, they got rakes, and they're actually making booms of sorts to clean up an area so hopefully it won't burn. And that the fire will stop, says, yeah, I have no fuel to burn, so I'll stop here. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Same thing with oil booms. It doesn't always work. So we really haven't made tremendous advances in oil spill recovery. That's my concern. We haven't made big advances in fires. You read these fires, 200,000 acres, 600 homes, people knocking on the door. You got to leave your house. 16 people died. People die, houses lost, property lost, environmental impact, what have you. And really what you're going to do is just minimize the impacts. You're going to prioritize. You've got to triage. You can't get no one ever said, put that whole fire out right away. It's generally saying, protect this area, protect that area, whatever. And that's what we're doing in oil spills. It's huge. Mother Nature's going to really call the shots. And so we have to deal with that. We have to understand what Mother Nature's going to do. We have to anticipate where that's going to be. And we have to protect those areas that are most sensitive and prioritize and what have you. So it spreads like forest fires. The organization is overwhelming. And there's thousands of people you're trying to manage. And we learned that the industry needs to be better prepared. They were definitely on their heels at that time. The industry is far more prepared today, but still a challenge as far as picking up oil. It's still an issue where you're not going to pick up huge amounts. You're going to pick up about 10%. So which 10% do you want to pick up? What areas do you want to protect? We also learned how clean is clean. You can go too far There are a lot of stories about during Exxon Valdez. We use hot water. And I know before the Exxon Valdez, I remember the philosophy was all vestiges of oil shall be removed. That was kind of the philosophy. Well, that's not really the best answer all the time. In doing so, you can cause more harm than good. So what is the net environmental benefit of what you're doing? There's a lot of that was going on as Exxon Valdez developed. We got smarter and smarter as far as what should we use and how far should we go. Let's put some set-aside beaches and see what the impacts are if you did nothing or basic cleanup. So those lessons, fortunately, have been applied to a lot of good studies, a lot of information available these days on different techniques and different pros and cons of different techniques and in the toolbox. But it's a smarter toolbox than it was back then. We have much more understanding of the pros and cons of different techniques. We clearly, and this is where my focus is, but not all my focus is that prevention is more effective than cleanup. And my analogy is that if you drove a Volvo and followed the speed limit, whatever, and wore your airbags, or had the airbags and wore your seatbelt and what have you, your likelihood of having an accident is very low. But you still want ambulances because you know some cement truck could run into a T-bone you at the light or whatever, and the Volvo's not going to save the day, but it'll minimize the chance of that happening and minimize the chance of you going to the hospital. So you still need the ambulances, despite the fact we have speed limits and ABS brakes and airbags and seat belts and what have you. You still need the ambulances, but clearly the prevention tools is is the best return on investment. But we can't be naive to think that that's just going to look the problem. Gary talked about the history and cyclical thing. We're going to have more accidents. There's a lot of close calls, but we can intervene a lot. And that's a lot of my focus right now. I'll get into that a little bit. We need a triage response, in my mind. We really have to prioritize which National Swiss tree needs protected, or walrus haul out, or sea lion rookery, whatever. You have to prioritize. You can't say pick up all the oil because you can't pick it all up. So in some cases, you have to sacrifice a beach to protect another area. So you diversion boom into another area, but protect the more sensitive ones. So that's clearly a thing that we learned a lot when the Exxon Valdez, the first time we really said, we cannot pick this all up. Let's prioritize. There are no silver bullets for recovering oil. It's still a hard, laborious, time-consuming process. The sooner we start, the more effective we are. The more prepared we are, the more effective we will be. And so those are the things. Time is your enemy. In some cases, in oil spill response, time is your enemy. You want to get as soon as possible because it just expands logarithmically. And the more time you allow it to sit around, the currents, the tides, the winds are all going to impact it and make it harder and harder and harder to clean up. So immediate response is the best answer. And the other thing is a lot of thought and a lot of work has been done in pre-planning as far as what would be the strategy if we know right now. Irma is a great example of pre-planning, pre-identifying. We did not have that information available in Exxon Valdez. And today, when you have spills, when you can use a computer and technology, have this information available to everybody on their iPhones and iPads, that suddenly you're getting information that's very useful, can have tremendous impact in minimizing the impacts of the oil spill, knowing which areas to protect, which technologies to use, and what have you. Open 90 certainly was a result of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It was the most sweeping legislation and had international ramifications, obviously, in light of the fact that ships from around the world come to the United States, and then the International Maritime Organization said, we need to do this everywhere. They really bolstered the federal on-scene coordinator role. There's some questions and competition of who's on first, who's driving the show. And if the spill presents a substantial threat to human health and welfare, it's very clear the federal on-scene coordinator shall drive the show and shall direct. Double hull tankers was an outcome, and I think we finally phased out the end of the double hull. There's no single hull tankers anymore, other than a really limited situation. But basically, all tankers now are double hull, which wouldn't have saved the day in Exxon Valdez, but probably would have kept about 60% of the oil that was spilled, kept it in the vessel. So it would have reduced the amount of oil spilled, clearly. It's not the panacea, but it's a good way to minimize the consequence. Kind of like airbags and seatbelts. They can make a difference. You may still get hurt, but they'll make a big difference as to whether you have them or not, as to what the outcomes are. Increase the liability, providing more motivation to vessels to be not to have oil spills, decrease their safety nets, increase the oil spill response requirements for shoreside response, and develop regional citizens advisory councils for oversight so that a lot of people are watching and providing input. Those who impact those communities had some input. Expanded vessel tracking. As I said beforehand, the Valdez ran aground beyond the reach of the Coast Guard, beyond the monitoring, beyond the last police radar trap, if you will, which I can relate to. But instead of, it's by 400%. Basically, I think they tracked about 30 miles, and now they track all the way out through Prince William Sound, which is another 30, 40 miles, and then another 60 miles offshore. So they dramatically increased the oversight and monitoring of that. And my real mantra, but not exclusively, is kind of what Admiral North, who I thought was a brilliant man and chief of Marine Safety, and of course they all are if they're in that position anyway. But when he talked about Open 90 and he talked about the consequences, he certainly put that the prevention is still the best response when he talked to Congress. And I think although all of us, even those who are in the business of oil spill response, will agree prevention is the best, but we're also not naive enough. We understand that's going to happen. So, and so what are the things we're doing now prevention-wise? And you think back to Exxon Valdez, why won't it happen today? A lot of things have to go wrong to replicate that incident. First of all, the master was supposed to be on the bridge, wasn't on the bridge. Well, now there's a pilot on the bridge also, in addition to the masters. There's 2 licensed officers on that vessel ensuring a safe transit. The Coast Guard is now watching throughout the transit. There are 2 tugs escorting that vessel. So everybody has to make a mistake. The Coast Guard has to make a mistake. Those 2 captains on the ship have to make mistakes. And the 2 captains on the tugboats have to make mistakes. There's a lot of people have to screw up. And the tugboats will help in case there's a casualty to the vessel. And they also have immediate response right there. The yellow vessel and the tail of that vessel is actually a response vessel. It can immediately respond. I talked about time beforehand. They're there. Not in the shipyard. They're right there on scene. And they can make much more impact, and a positive impact if they're on scene. What are we missing? I think technology. There's a tremendous growth in technology. I don't think we're as aggressive on the use of, and I can see it all the time. We're not as aggressive in applying technology as much as we should. I think Irma is a great example of how we are applying technology. It's a force multiplier. Having information at your fingertips, it makes a big, big difference. I think there's too much focus on the tankers and vessels having vessel response plans. One of the things my business does, a nonprofit, to keep the lights on, to pay for our vessel tracking system with 120 sites throughout the Alaska, up in the Arctic and Aleutians. We do a lot of consulting work. I did expert witness for a Prestige case. I do vessel response plans and security plans, what have you. And my staff say we were not doing any more vessel response plans. It's ridiculous. It takes a whole year, 300 pages of a plan, and that vessel will never read it. It will never read a plan. The ship captain is not going to pick up a manual and start reading it at the height of a spill. He's going to be worried about many other things, not the least of which his career just went down the tubes, or his life that could be in danger. He's not going to read it. It's the oil spill recovery organizations the one we need to look at. They're the ones that actually, the only thing you need is the phone number in the back of that thing. Who's my qualified individual? Who's my oil spill recovery organization? They do that work. I don't have a fire plan for my house that tells me how I'm going to deal with a fire in my house. I have 911. I've never fought a fire. I don't want to fight a fire. I just want 911. I'm going to step out of the house and let the experts who do firefighting do it. So I think the focus on vessel response plans, in some cases, I think, and we're getting smarter. I think the transition's getting better. I like the approach the Coast Guard's taking, the shipboard marine firefighting salvage regulations. They basically said, we want your salver to have a copy of your plan of your vessel, how it's laid out, what the tanks are configured, whatever. So the salver, who's going to actually do the response, has the information available. And vice the ship captain, who's got many other things to do. So I think that's a transition. We're also realizing non-tank vessels, we kind of fixed the problem with tankers. There's so much focus on tankers, these non-tank vessels are not a problem. I think the other thing, we talk a lot about maritime domain awareness. We have to move to maritime domain management. How do we manage those vessels offshore versus just being aware of what those vessels are doing? This is kind of what we're looking up in Alaska as far as the shipping. This is just at one moment of time. And how we can take this information and analyze and do risk assessments of Bering Strait going up to the Arctic. And then we don't have maritime domain awareness, which happened a couple years ago, the Selding IU. We didn't know that vessel was in distress until the captain decided to finally call us 18 hours later and said, guess what? We're broken down. We're coming towards your beach. That's one ship, by the way, split in half. And unfortunately, the Coast Guard went to pull the crew off the ship in a helicopter, and a 100-foot wave hit the helicopter, immersed it. Helicopter crashed. 6 crew members they just rescued a couple moments early perished in the crash, and miraculously the Coast Guard crew, because they had the right survival gear on, and a helicopter was right by them, plucked them out of the water and saved their lives. But a very tragic major oil spill, a loss of lives. Had we known, which we do now, had we known that vessel was in distress earlier on, that would have been averted. So today in Alaska, the tool that we're applying is we have, and this is kind of a voluntary measure with the Alaska Maritime Prevention Response Network, we outline safety zones, safe passages, and we monitor compliance. Kind of like this. This is one of my employees. I told him to say, go 40 miles an hour past me, and the guy went 38 because he saw this little object along the road that told him how fast he was going. So he blew me off, and he knows that doesn't go to the police station. He knows that doesn't write tickets, but he jammed on the brakes. He's got the brake lights on. So I fired him, obviously. But the point is that monitoring makes a difference. It influences behavior. I know every time I see a police car, there's 2 things I do. I check to see my seatbelt on, I check my speed limit. And so now, guess what? A lot of people are monitoring. And this is what happens when you're not watching. This is a container ship in Aleutian Islands, a mile offshore, sightseeing. Sightseeing. If anything goes wrong with that single-engine ship that's going on the beach, because there's nobody within 600 miles to give them a hand. This is a ship that's serpentining through the Aleutian Islands, sightseeing, within a mile offshore, before we implemented these risk reduction measures, before we started managing traffic. This is the same ship. 2 months later, we implemented the risk reduction measures. It's staying offshore. And so on. So I think that, the technology is the thing as far as complying, monitoring, and enhanced response, locating response vessels. Used to be a real trick in the past. You call tug officers on Saturday at 1 in the morning. Where are your tugs? I'll get back to you. You don't do that anymore. We just look at the screen. We know where they are. So when I look at the concept of prevention and response, both those things, I think it really comes down to information, time, and capabilities. Those are 3 important tools. You can have information, time, but you don't have capabilities, who cares? It just frustrates you. You need all that stuff. So in the prevention side of it, you have information when a vessel breaks down, which we do. Alarms go off. A vessel goes to 3 knots. It goes too close to shore. Alarm goes off. 24-hour operations center contacts the vessel. They can start initiating a response. And if the vessel's far enough offshore, we have time before it hits the beach. If it's 1 mile off the beach, we may have information, we have capabilities, but we have no time to do anything about it. Yes, and similarly in response, the same thing goes in oil spill response. That's my last slide, actually. So in closing, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that people like Dave Shangli, Bob Mastraccio, Otto Harrison, who've since passed away, there's so many people immerse themselves and sacrifice tremendous amounts. So a lot of people complain about Exxon Valdez, but I can tell you, I've never seen people work harder than Exxon Valdez. And lastly, we also have, like Boston, we too have heavy morning traffic. It's just a little different in Juneau, Alaska. So that's it.